Hello and welcome to Ellroy Reads. Now, shortly before the taping of this episode, I spoke to the producer of this show, Barbara, and I said to her, "Do you mind if I shake up the format a little bit?" And Barbara replied, "Yes, but I want you to play a role for me that an actor's just relinquished. He made a bit of a mess of it." I said, "Sure, Barbara, no problem. I told you not to hire Daniel Craig." Okay, so what's different about this week's show is ordinarily we talk about books that inspired James Ellroy, novels or non-fiction that moved him and had a big influence on both his life and his work. But for this episode, we are going to be talking about Love Me, Fierce and Danger, the life of James Ellroy, Ellroy's biography, which was written by yours truly. I feel that as we've done over 30 episodes now and I've built up an army of subscribers, it might be a good time to give you some background about the book. Persuade some of you to buy it or make an early Christmas present for someone. Okay, so before I took on the role as James Ellroy's biographer, I'd written 3 books on Ellroy, and I'd got to know him a little bit. We were friendly, and we were well acquainted. But those books being rather academic in tone, I'm an academic as a career, hadn't really broken out. They were a little bit limited to the library market, and I wanted to write a book about Ellroy that was going to break out. And it occurred to me the only book that would really do that would be a full-length literary biography. The only thing was the task seemed so momentous that I wasn't sure at first whether I had it in me. It probably defeated other biographers. In fact, around about 2019, when I was putting my proposal together for Bloomsbury, I happened to know that Ellroy was scouting for biographers and he was working from a list, and my name wasn't on the list at that time. But Bloomsbury liked my proposal for the biography. They liked the 2 chapters that I'd submitted them, and they gave me the contract. So then I phoned up Ellroy and I gave him the good news, and he was absolutely delighted. And our old acquaintance suddenly became once again a blossoming friendship as we worked together and spent a lot of time talking together. He'd actually struck a very tenuous deal with another biographer whose name I won't mention. But he's like, he doesn't like me. He doesn't like me. As soon as I get off the phone to you, I'm going to fire him. And I'm like, oh, don't do that. You know, I'm quite an affable type of guy. So the thought of getting somebody else sacked really kind of upset me at the time. But, excuse me, that's publishing for you. But I believe that other biographer was rather relieved to relinquish the position, that they had not hit it off from day one. Anyway, so work began, and the process of working was just, I'm lucky I have a living subject. I could spend time with him, and he could direct me in certain ways. The biography was kind of part authorized, but also part it came from my own initiative. So, like, I also had a degree of independence, and Ellroy was quite cool about that. And we agreed that I would have to talk to absolutely everybody who has known Ellroy and was still alive and would agree to talk to me. In many respects, that led to me talking to his army of ex-girlfriends. You know, Ellroy's twice divorced. Had quite a promiscuous lifestyle. I think I can say that bluntly and without disrespect. And many of his exes still hold him in great esteem, even though the relationship never panned out, and still think of him fondly. There were exceptions. There was actually a threat of legal action at one point, and that could have killed the project. But fortunately, the book went through a grueling 3-day legal read in which we went through every single line of the book and make sure it was entirely fact-checked, and there was absolutely nothing libelous in it. Everything could be backed up factually, and we considered ourselves libel-proof. And that's very important, particularly in the American market. But so speaking to these ex-partners was a wonderful experience. We had very intimate conversations, and it was a great experience for me. I've always enjoyed the company of women and had lots of female friends. And I'd enjoyed that connection and that intimacy that came with these women. And many of whom were, I would say, Ellroy's age, so they were in their late 60s or early 70s, looking back on a romance that they had 40 or 50 years ago, when they were very, very different people, when in many ways they're perhaps much more naive, or that's the way that love makes us. And for instance, I spoke to one woman who was Ellroy's girlfriend when they were both homeless and living in the LA Park system. And she didn't remember him at first, but then when I reminded her, I showed her two photos of Ellroy, one a recent one as a relatively old man, and another which was a mugshot or a booking photo of Ellroy taken around the time that she was going out with him. And she burst into tears. It was very moving, but through the tears, we had a very, very positive conversation. And believe it or not, she still sleeps outside. She has a nice porch home in Central California, and she still likes to sleep outside on the porch, surrounded by animals. And she was a writer herself. So there were many, many great conversations with the ex-partners, some of them were distinguished writers themselves. One of them was working as a hospital chaplain, and this was at the height of COVID, so there was mostly Zoom conversations. Yes, working as a hospital chaplain in New Mexico, wearing the full protective gear, which during lockdown made her look like she was walking into Chernobyl or something. And it was very, very interesting. At one point, and this is a matter of public record, so I'm not laying out any secrets here. At one point, one of Ellroy's ex-partners, Erica Schickel, wrote a memoir. He regarded it as a kiss and tell, called The Big Hurt. And The Big Hurt is a fine book in many respects, but rather hilariously, I was given the job of reading the book and telling Ellroy everything that was in it. And going into that meeting with Ellroy, having read A Kiss and Tell about him, was nerve-wracking. But you know what? He took it like a real trooper. I actually think that he kind of enjoyed it. He loves being combative. It's almost like a form of flirting with him. And he was very disarming at the end of the conversation. He's like, "You never have to worry about telling me anything, Steve." Of course, I was a little bit worried, but I do appreciate his charm and his wit and his patience in that regard. I spoke to many prominent novelists, Jonathan Kellerman, Ian Rankin, David Peace. I absolutely adore David Peace, and we're actually working together on a project now. But David, I'm sure you know, is the author of the Red Riding trilogy, and a British author who now lives in Japan. And when we first spoke, I was like, "Oh, David, you're the 70th person I've talked to." Let's see, I've talked to Ellroy's ex-girlfriends, and he's like, "Were they the other 69?" He was very funny and marvelous good company. And talking to Hollywood people, which was a huge thrill. Getting the interviews with Hollywood people was difficult. It required a lot of persistence, because you had to get through their lawyers, their agents, their managers, and you had to keep persisting with those queries until you practically almost felt like a stalker. And then one day you get an email or a phone call, and it's like you called them yesterday. They're just like, "Oh, they'd be delighted to talk to you." So, fortunately, sometimes actors are out of work, they're resting, so they are often performers very willing to talk to you. Some of the Hollywood people I talked to, the beautiful Dana Delaney, who had a friendship with Ellroy, which caused gossip at the time. Two good-looking single people, and she revealed to me right at the end of the interview. It was almost like she was holding back on it, and then finally she revealed to me that Ellroy had actually proposed to her during their friendship, which was, I suppose, a form of courtship. And if you want to read the full story on that, buy the book. Okay. Brian Helgeland, the Oscar-winning screenwriter and now director of LA Confidential, a wonderful, wonderful man. The producer, Clark Peterson, the producer of Monster. Many, many great people. The actor Tony Dennison, who worked on an adaptation of Dick Contina's Blues, which sadly didn't get made, but he was absolutely wonderful. He was just wonderful Italian-American personality, very handsome, not a hair out of place, and very, very charming. And at the end of it, he's just like, "Oh, on my word, I'm getting really excited about Dick Contina's Blues again. I'm maybe I'm going to look back into getting it made because he still owned the rights. Him and Jeff Stein, the music video director who also directed the Who documentary "Kids Are All Right," and a screenwriter. Um, so there were three of them, and they were all wonderful, and they'd all worked on it together. And you know what? An adaptation of Dick Contino's Blues made by those three guys would have been extraordinary. But it's just one of those cruel things about Hollywood that, often the best projects don't get made, and we get, crap like Transformers 6 or something. But anyway, enough of me complaining. The one novelist who was kind of even harder to get in touch with than all of the Hollywood people, was the attorney and author Andrew Vax, author of the Burke series. Uh, the Burke series follows a vigilante who hunts down pedophiles in New York, and Vax was an attorney in private practice who prosecuted child molesters, and he had this elaborate security system in place. I had to write to a PO box address in Chicago, and then finally I get an answer back from his office in New York to ring this number, etc., and so forth. And he wouldn't talk to me without Ellroy's permission. They hadn't spoken in 30 years, and I sensed there was some sort of falling out, and that was quite often the case with Ellroy, that there'd been a lot of very intense friendships, which were almost like romances in themselves, which had ended abruptly over some slight, which had proved irreconcilable, which was sad. But anyway, so I asked James. I said, "Vax will only talk to me with your permission. Could you write him a letter?" And he did, and I hope they had a conversation in friendship, because Vax subsequently agreed to the interview, and he was. I wouldn't say he was like the most pleasant person in to talk to. He was kind of scary and intense. And even his friends called him Satan, because I've spoken to many of his friends since. An affectionate Satan. And anyway, shortly thereafter he died. But you know what? He kept working right until his dying breath. He really believed in this cause of child protection. And I spoke to him on a Sunday in his office, and he told me I could be called away at any moment because I'm working triage. And if a youth is arrested, I get called in. And I just thought he was a remarkable man and an inspiring man. And, there were many moments. But in terms of, those are the kind of behind the scenes gossip for you. In terms of the narrative, I knew from the beginning that I wanted the first page to start with Jean Ellroy's murder in 1958. She is recently divorced from Ellroy's father, Armand. She's been on a number of dates. On one night, she's very unfortunate to go on a date with the wrong guy, the guy who was never identified but was known as a swarthy man, and she is raped and murdered that night, and the case is never solved. And of course, Lee, as he was then, his legal name Lee, or James Ellroy as it's easy to refer to him, he is traumatized by this event, as you can only imagine he would be. He lives with his father's days as a Hollywood fixer, as Rita Hayworth's business manager. In fact, there's the full story of how Ellroy's father arranged the wedding, did all the planning for the Rita Hayworth's marriage to Prince Ali Khan in the south of France, and that is a fascinating story. Trust me, that was absolutely a joy to research. But his glory days are behind him, and Ellroy grows to kind of hate living with his father, even though he'd looked forward to it at the time because he'd been the lenient parent. Jean Ellroy was disciplinarian, but then he found out there's a sting in the tail to that, and Ellroy goes through the periods of after his father dies. He's briefly in the army. He goes through periods of homelessness, drug addiction, jail time, ill health that nearly kills him before getting clean at 27 and pursuing his passion for crime fiction, which had always been ingrained in him. So it made sense to start with Jean Ellroy's murder and then jump back in time and tell the story of Armand and Jean. Again, fascinating. Armand served in World War One. Jean, was a nurse. She was born in Wisconsin. She goes to Chicago School of Nursing, and she ends up moving to LA after winning a beauty contest. When they eventually meet, and Armand's Hollywood years. And against this, you get all the backdrop of the history that's going on in America at the time. So World War One, World War Two, the Hollywood golden years, and going forward, the Manson family murders, Ellroy's brush in the army that nearly had him sent going to Vietnam. So you've got a lot of good background detail. That's all very, very important to the story. And I knew as well that it would have to be a story. I mean, I'm lucky because Ellroy's had such a fascinating life. I mean, a lot of writers don't. It is a solitary profession. How do you put that in a narrative arc if you're living a lot of the time in your imagination? But Ellroy, is a very active person. He's almost got this kind of like activist personality. I don't mean politically, but in terms of like he has to seduce every woman. He has to get the biggest deals. He's making up for lost time, and even that lost time, when you're dealing with overdoses and whatnot, is all dramatically interesting. But I knew I wanted to give the audiences, the reader, the audience. I'm already thinking my Hollywood deal. No, I wanted to give the reader, chapter by chapter, a strong sense of time and place. And some of my favourite settings to write about was the chapter "Debris by the Sea," which is what Ellroy and his buddies used to call themselves in AA. So that was Venice Beach, AA, the late 70s. Ellroy had just got clean. What happens when you become sober? Your sex drive comes back. And it was pre-AIDS, it was a very kind of loose scene. It was the hot tub fever was sweeping LA. And speaking to people who were quite inspiring from that period, they'd got clean, they'd done incredible things with their lives. And they were quite candid. They're like, well, yeah, it was a crazy scene. That was one of my favorite periods. Also, New York in the early 80s. Ellroy moved to New York because he felt like that's where a writer should be. It was his first time that he'd moved anywhere but LA or Almonte. And he thought he was going to be the next big thing. And in many ways he was, but he didn't realize that it wasn't going to be so easy. He has a real humbling in New York in the early 80s, but the literary scene in that period was really, really fascinating. I didn't realize how many science fiction writers Ellroy hung out with. One of the things is, like, going in, I was already probably the kind of Ellroy expert, the Ellroy scholar. But whenever you develop an expertise on something, you think you know everything, you dig deeper, you realize you don't know anything. You realize there's always something more to be discovered. And Ellroy's connection with science fiction or speculative fiction writers, Steve Erickson, there's a wonderful story about their falling out as a friendship. Chip Delaney, dating science fiction writers like Susan Palwick, Alan Kushner. There were big connections there. And there were just many, many fascinating stories. And I'm pleased to say that the book came out, was a commercial success. It was also a critical success. It won some fabulous reviews. And then eventually, in May of this year, it won the Edgar-Award, which was just the highest honor for me. It won the Edgar-Award for Best Biography. And I got to go to New York. I was at the ceremony. It was a dream come true. It was just like the Oscars. They had the in memoriam reel. They had, they'd read out the 5 nominees for each one. They'd open the envelope. It'd be like, and the winner is. I was very lucky. I was sat next to Colson Whitehead at our particular dinner table. That was just pure luck. But he was an absolutely charming man, very inspiring, and it was absolutely fantastic to get a photo of him and to monopolize his conversation for a couple of hours. And yes, it won the Edgar-Award for Best Biography, so that was a huge honor for me. And it's a huge honor, to have done this book. I will write more books. I will write books that are increasingly professional, increasingly accomplished, I hope. As a writer, your technique improves over time. But I think the reason this book came out so well, not to be immodest, is that I was born to write this book. And there wasn't a single day it felt like hard work. Even when there was a legal challenge, even when I couldn't, I was banging my head against a wall to get an interview with someone, it always came out well. And it always was just tremendous fun. and I think it shows on the page that it's a very natural book, and many of you who are watching this will have read it already. If you haven't, go out and buy yourself a copy, and let me know what you think. Okay, thank you very much for indulging me talking about Love Me First and Danger, the Life of James Ellroy. Next week, normal service will resume with another look at a book that has inspired James Ellroy. In the meantime, buy this one. See you next time. Bye-bye.